Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The morning started like any other on the trail. Clear skies, the scent of damp earth, and the chatter of eager voices filling the air. I had led this route dozens of times, the forest paths etched into my memory like a well-worn map. My group that day consisted of 6 teenagers, all new to hiking but full of energy. I had spent the early part of the hike answering questions about the flora and fauna, pointing out birds darting between the trees, and ensuring everyone kept pace. The trail wound through dense undergrowth, its canopy shading us from the sun's warmth. The kids laughed and joked, their voices mingling with the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. As the hours passed, the trail's incline grew steeper, and their chatter turned into focused silence. By the time we reached a small clearing for a rest, their faces were flushed, and they eagerly dropped their packs, pulling out snacks and water. I took a moment to survey the group, counting heads out of habit. 5. My stomach tightened. I scanned the clearing again, thinking one of them might be crouched behind a bush or just out of sight. Still 5. A sense of unease began to creep in. I called the missing teen's name, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the forest. No response. Forcing calm into my voice, I told the group to stay put while I searched the immediate area. The kids' laughter faded into uneasy whispers as I stepped back onto the trail. The forest, so alive with sound earlier, seemed to have gone eerily still. Retracing our steps felt like walking into a different forest. The vibrant chatter of the group was gone, replaced by a dense silence that pressed against me. Each step crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in an otherwise still world. I called out the teen's name again, louder this time, my voice ricocheting off the trees before being swallowed by the silence. I moved quickly, scanning the path and its surroundings for any sign of the boy. My years as a guide had taught me how to pick up on subtle disturbances, a broken branch, scuffed dirt, the faint impression of a footprint, but the trail looked untouched, pristine. My pulse quickened. As I rounded a bend, movement flickered at the edge of my vision. Someone, darted between the trees, just out of focus. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm. It could have been the boy, or it could have been nothing, just the sway of a branch or a trick of the light. I hesitated, scanning the underbrush for movement. The figure, if it had been one, was gone. Shaking off the unease, I pressed forward. There was no time to waste. The forest felt darker now, though the sun still hung high in the sky. I told myself it was just the thickening canopy, the shadows playing tricks on me. Still, the sensation of being watched gnawed at the edges of my mind. I found him at the edge of a steep drop-off, his back pressed against a tree, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Relief surged through me, but it was quickly tempered by the look in his eyes, wide, unfocused, and filled with raw fear. "Are you hurt?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He shook his head, his breathing shallow and rapid. Slowly I approached, careful not to startle him. When I was close enough, I noticed his hands trembling as he gripped the tree behind him, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He began to talk in broken sentences, his words spilling out in a rush. He had followed something, an animal, he said, that darted off the trail. He thought it was a fox at first, but it moved too quickly, weaving through the trees in a way that seemed unnatural. When he tried to return to the group, he realized he was lost. Then he saw the figure. "It was running after me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't run like a person." My stomach churned, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I didn't ask questions, didn't dwell on what he'd said. Instead, I guided him away from the cliff's edge, keeping one hand on his shoulder as we made our way back toward the group. By the time we returned, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The group's relief at seeing their missing friend was palpable, but the day's events had drained their earlier enthusiasm. I could see the exhaustion in their faces, the unease lingering in their glances toward the trees. With darkness approaching, I made the call to set up camp for the night. It wasn't ideal, but navigating the trail in the dark was too risky. We worked quickly, pitching tents and gathering firewood. The flames brought a measure of comfort, their flickering light pushing back the encroaching darkness. As we huddled around the fire, the forest seemed to close in around us. The usual nighttime sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were conspicuously absent. Then came the sound. It started low, a guttural howl that seemed to vibrate through the air. At first I thought it might be a wolf, but there was something off about it, something almost human. The sound rose and fell, distorted, as if echoing through a tunnel. The kids froze, their faces pale in the firelight. The howl came again, closer this time, sending a chill down my spine. I tightened my grip on the small hatchet I kept by my side. The fire crackled, its light flickering as if in response to the sound. We sat in tense silence, listening, waiting. The sound didn't come again that night, but the sense of unease it left behind lingered long after the forest fell quiet. The fire burned low, its warmth barely holding back the cold that crept in from the forest. We sat close to its glow, the group huddled together in silence. No one spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. My eyes scanned the edge of the clearing, the darkness beyond the firelight pressing in like a solid wall. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me, though I kept my expression calm for the kids' sake. The howling had stopped, but the forest felt anything but safe. At one point, I thought I saw movement, just a fleeting shadow at the corner of my vision. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to keep me on edge. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and stared into the darkness, willing myself to stay alert. The kids eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, their exhaustion overtaking their fear. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, my senses on high alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional pop of the firewood. Twice I thought I heard faint footsteps beyond the clearing, deliberate and measured, but when I turned my head there was nothing there. The hours crawled by. I forced myself to stay focused, to remind myself of my responsibility to these kids. As the night wore on, I began to feel the weight of exhaustion, my eyelids growing heavy despite my best efforts. Just as I began to drift, a sharp rustling sound jolted me back to attention. It was close, too close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the perimeter of the camp, the dim light of the fire barely reaching the edges of the clearing. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just beyond the flickering light, a faint shape moved. It was low to the ground, its form indistinct, but the way it moved was wrong, jerky, unnatural. I gripped the hatchet tighter, my knuckles white, but the shape disappeared before I could react. The forest fell silent again, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, turning the forest's oppressive darkness into a patchwork of gold and green. The fire had long since burned out, and the kids stirred from their restless sleep, their faces drawn and pale. The events of the night hung over us like a heavy fog, but no one spoke of them. I urged the group to pack quickly, eager to leave the clearing behind. The tension eased slightly as the sun climbed higher, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we set off, I walked at the back of the group, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest, now bathed in daylight, seemed almost normal again, but I knew better than to trust its tranquility. As we hiked, I noticed small, unsettling details. A broken branch that hadn't been there before, fresh marks in the dirt that didn't match our footsteps. They were subtle, easy to miss, but they confirmed what I already suspected. Something, or someone, had been near our camp during the night. The kids didn't seem to notice, their spirits lifting slightly as we put distance between ourselves and the clearing. I forced myself to focus on the trail ahead, on getting us back to safety, but the sense of unease never left me. The trail wound downward, the terrain growing less rugged as we neared the edge of the forest. The kids' chatter returned, tentative at first, but gradually more animated. I stayed silent, my attention divided between guiding them and scanning our surroundings. The forest still felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with the chirping birds or rustling leaves. As we descended a particularly steep section of the trail, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Just off the path, hidden among the trees, was a series of small, human-like footprints. They were fresh, their edges crisp in the soft earth, and they seemed to circle back toward the direction we had come from. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to keep moving. The last thing I wanted was to alarm the group when we were so close to safety. The rest of the hike passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone emerging from the trees. But the forest remained still, its secrets hidden in the shifting shadows. The highway stretched endlessly before me, the road illuminated only by the faint beams of my headlights cutting through the darkness. The quiet hum of the engine was soothing, a rhythmic companion on this uneventful drive. It was late, and the emptiness of the road had a tranquil quality, the kind that lets your mind drift without the clutter of distraction. Miles of nothingness surrounded me, the occasional highway marker or faded billboard, my only indication that I wasn't lost in some void. My gas gauge hovered just above empty, the warning light flickering on intermittently. I scanned the sides of the road for a sign of civilization, relieved when a neon glow appeared on the horizon. A gas station emerged from the darkness, its fluorescent lights buzzing softly under a flickering "Open 24 hours" sign. The station was small, almost out of place against the expanse of empty land around it, but it would do. Pulling in, I parked by one of the pumps and stepped out, the chill of the night biting against my skin. The stillness was unnerving. There were no other cars, no sounds beyond the faint buzz of the neon sign and the occasional rustle of wind. I secured the pump and let it run as I headed toward the convenience store. It wasn't just gas I needed. I had a long stretch ahead and wanted a snack to keep me alert. The glass door squeaked as I pushed it open, the harsh fluorescent lighting inside feeling almost intrusive after the dim calm of the night. The store was small, with narrow aisles packed tightly with snacks, drinks, and various road trip essentials. A lone clerk stood behind the counter, his eyes glued to the small TV perched on a shelf. He didn't look up as I entered, his expression as blank as the static buzz of the television. I grabbed a chocolate bar and a bottle of water, moving deliberately, the silence of the store amplifying every sound I made. As I turned toward the counter, I noticed him, a man standing in the farthest aisle, half hidden by the shelves. At first he seemed to be browsing, his fingers brushing over cans and packages, but something about him felt off. He wasn't picking anything up. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Then he looked at me. Just a glance, quick and almost dismissive, but it was enough to send a small chill down my spine. His eyes lingered too long, his expression unreadable. I told myself it was nothing. It was late, and we were both likely tired, caught in the strange atmosphere of this lonely station. Still, I felt a weight in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that I couldn't explain. I approached the counter, paid for my items, and left without looking back at him. The clerk's monotone voice barely registered as he handed me my change, and I didn't bother with a receipt. Stepping outside, the cold air hit me again, sharper this time, and I felt a strange urge to hurry. I reached my car and climbed in, tossing my snack onto the passenger seat and starting the engine. As I pulled away from the pump, I glanced back at the convenience store. The man from the aisle was walking out, his pace brisk, his head down. My eyes followed him as he moved to a car parked near the far edge of the lot. He didn't look at me, but something about his movements made my stomach tighten. I turned onto the road, dismissing my unease. It was just a coincidence. People stop at gas stations all the time. But as I drove, headlights appeared behind me, bright and unwavering. I checked my rearview mirror, trying not to jump to conclusions. It was a lonely road, and it made sense that someone might be traveling the same direction. Still, the sight of those lights felt ominous, a fixed point that grew closer with each passing mile. I decided to test my suspicion, taking a deliberate left at an upcoming turnoff, a road I hadn't planned to take. The headlights followed, their glow unwavering as they mirrored my movements. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and my heart began to race. Another turn, sharper this time, and still the car followed, its headlights locked onto me like a predator tracking prey. It was no coincidence. The highway was no longer an option. I couldn't keep driving straight, knowing this stranger was right behind me. Desperation overtook my growing fear as I remembered a shortcut, a narrow back road I'd traveled once before. It wasn't ideal, poorly lit and uneven, but it was a way to lose him. I veered sharply onto the road, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel as I made the turn. The back road was as isolated as I'd remembered, with overgrown trees leaning inward, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out what little moonlight there was. My headlights illuminated the gravel and the occasional sign, but the road seemed endless, stretching deeper into the dark. The stranger's car followed, its headlights slicing through the shadows behind me. I drove faster than I should have, the car jostling with every bump and dip in the road. My breaths were shallow, my focus locked on the path ahead. Then, without warning, the headlights behind me disappeared. One moment they were there, glaring and persistent, and the next they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop to question it. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The absence of the lights should have brought relief, but it didn't. The silence of the road felt oppressive, the shadows closing in as if the stranger were still there just beyond my sight. After what felt like an eternity, the shortcut reconnected with the highway, and I merged onto the open road. It wasn't until I saw the faint glow of another gas station in the distance that I allowed myself to breathe again. The lights of the new gas station seemed like a beacon in the darkness, offering a moment of respite after the harrowing chase. I pulled into the lot and parked beneath the bright floodlights, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. The busy scene, a few cars at the pumps, a handful of people milling about, felt like a world away from the isolation of the back road. Inside the station, the air was warm and stale, filled with the hum of refrigerators and the faint sound of a radio playing some old rock song. I grabbed a coffee, needing something to steady my nerves. My reflection in the store's window caught my eye as I waited to pay. My face was pale, my eyes wide and darting. I looked like someone who'd seen a ghost. As I stepped outside, coffee in hand, my gaze instinctively scanned the parking lot. It was habit now, checking for the car, for those headlights. A jolt of fear hit me when I spotted a vehicle parked near the edge of the lot, its make and model eerily similar to the one that had been following me. The driver's seat was empty, the interior cloaked in shadows. I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I really lost the stranger? Or had he taken another route, anticipating my destination? The thought sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to stay composed. I climbed back into my car and locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was imagining connections where none existed. But the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing down like a weight I couldn't escape. I stayed parked for longer than I intended, watching the comings and goings of other customers while trying to convince myself to drive again. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift back to the car at the edge of the lot. No one approached it, no one got in or out. It just sat there, a silent and unmoving presence that seemed to mock my efforts to dismiss it as coincidence. Eventually, I decided I couldn't stay. If the car was connected to the stranger, I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. I started my engine and pulled onto the road, the bright lights of the station shrinking behind me. My shoulders tensed as I drove, every glance in the rearview mirror an exercise in dread. For a while, the road was empty, and I began to believe that maybe, finally, I was alone. But then I saw it, headlights in the distance, too far to identify but close enough to reignite my fear. The lights grew larger, their glow piercing the darkness as they closed the gap between us. My heart sank as the vehicle matched my speed, keeping a careful distance but never falling out of sight. This wasn't paranoia, it was happening again. The fear returned with a vengeance, gripping me tighter than before. My foot pressed harder on the gas, the engine whining as I sped down the empty road. The vehicle behind me stayed steady, its headlights unwavering. I didn't know what this person wanted, but their persistence was unnerving. It wasn't just a game of intimidation. It felt calculated, deliberate. I thought about pulling off the road, but where would I go? The darkness stretched endlessly around me, the trees lining the road like silent sentinels. Stopping felt like inviting danger, and the thought of confronting whoever was behind those headlights was more terrifying than the pursuit itself. The tension mounted with every passing mile, each turn of the wheel a test of my nerves. I tried weaving through side roads, hoping to shake the stranger, but they followed every move. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and quick. The car seemed to draw closer, the glare of its lights filling my mirrors. Then, without warning, it slowed. I glanced back in disbelief as the headlights faded into the distance, the car falling away until it disappeared entirely. Relief mixed with confusion as I tried to make sense of it. The amusement park loomed ahead, its crumbling gates tangled with ivy and rust. I had heard the stories about this place. A local legend whispered in hushed tones about strange happenings and a darkness that seemed to linger long after the ride stopped spinning. Most people avoided it, claiming it was cursed or haunted. For me, the lure was irresistible. I had to see it for myself. As I stepped through the broken gate, the air seemed heavier, the sounds of the outside world fading as the park enveloped me. The main path, once lined with cheerful decorations, was overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris. The skeletal remains of the attractions stood like sentinels, their faded paint and broken structures a testament to years of neglect. The silence was almost complete, save for the occasional creak of metal in the wind or the rustle of leaves. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I couldn't deny the strange beauty of the place. The overgrowth softened the sharp edges of decay, and the rusted rides seemed to hold stories of their own, frozen in time. But as I wandered deeper into the park, the unease began to creep in. At first, it was subtle, an inexplicable feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling for no reason. Then came the details I couldn't ignore. Near the carousel, clusters of candles stood arranged in uneven circles, their wax dripping onto the cracked pavement. Some of them were still lit, their flames flickering weakly against the faint breeze. Fresh footprints disturbed the thick layer of dust on the ground, and scattered among the debris were small animal skulls, bleached white and eerily clean. A chill ran through me as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. The park was supposed to be abandoned, but these signs suggested otherwise. The carousel stood at the heart of the park, its once bright horses now faded and chipped, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The platform creaked softly as I approached, the sound cutting through the oppressive stillness. The candles around its base seemed out of place, their dim light casting elongated shadows that danced across the peeling paint. I found myself staring, drawn in by the unsettling juxtaposition of decay and deliberate placement. I wanted to leave, but curiosity pulled me further in. My footsteps echoed faintly as I continued down the path, the weight of the silence pressing against me. It wasn't long before I saw it, a large tent standing in the middle of an open clearing. Its fabric was faded, the colors dull and lifeless, but it stood intact, an anomaly in the otherwise ruined park. My stomach tightened at the sight. Something about it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong here, even among the strangeness of the abandoned grounds. As I considered turning back, movement caught my eye. A figure slipped through the tent's entrance, their silhouette barely discernible before disappearing inside. My breath hitched and I froze in place. Logic told me to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But another part of me, a reckless, curious part, urged me forward. The decision was made for me when I heard a sound behind me. Turning sharply, I saw someone step out of the shadows, their face obscured by the dim light. Their posture was rigid, their presence imposing. The stranger's voice shattered the silence, guttural and angry, their words sharp and unintelligible. My body reacted before my mind could process the situation. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the uneven ground as I bolted down the nearest path. Behind me, the voice rose in intensity, shouting words I couldn't understand, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart raced as I darted between dilapidated attractions, the skeletal remains of rides blurring in my peripheral vision. The park, which had felt eerie but navigable moments ago, now seemed like a maze designed to trap me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, my only thought to escape. The footsteps behind me grew louder, the stranger closing the gap with frightening speed. I veered off the path, plunging into the overgrown grass that choked the edges of the park. Branches scraped against my skin as I stumbled through the vegetation, my eyes scanning for any place to hide. The shadows seemed to close in around me, the fading daylight offering little comfort. I didn't dare look back. I found a crumbling ticket booth at the edge of an old game stall, its wooden structure warped and splintered. Without thinking, I ducked behind it, pressing myself against the rotting wood. My chest heaved as I struggled to quiet my breathing, every inhale feeling impossibly loud. The footsteps slowed, growing deliberate, methodical. The sound of voices followed, low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. The ticket booth offered little cover, and I felt exposed despite the shadows. I curled into myself, trying to become as small and silent as possible. Time seemed to stretch painfully, each second an eternity as I waited for the strangers to pass. Occasionally I heard a whisper, sharp and fleeting, followed by the crunch of leaves or the snap of a twig. The oppressive stillness of the park seemed to amplify every sound, and my senses were on high alert. A shadow passed by the edge of the booth, so close I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as the person moved. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to move, not to make a sound. For a moment I thought I had been found when the footsteps paused just on the other side of the booth. But after what felt like hours, they moved on. I stayed frozen, unwilling to believe the danger had passed. The voices drifted further away, their tones still angry but less urgent. As the last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the park into darkness, I knew I had to leave soon, or risk being trapped here with them. Nightfall swallowed the amusement park in a suffocating darkness, leaving only faint outlines of the decayed structures visible under the dim glow of a rising moon. I remained crouched behind the ticket booth, my body rigid with tension, ears straining to catch any sound. The strangers' voices grew fainter, their footsteps gradually retreating into the depths of the park. Despite the apparent distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still nearby, waiting for me to make a mistake. The oppressive silence amplified every small noise. The distant creak of metal, the flutter of wings as a bird took flight, even the sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I fought to steady myself, forcing slow, shallow breaths. I couldn't afford to make a single sound. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My muscles ached from remaining still, but I didn't dare move. Every creak or rustle in the distance reignited my panic, making me second-guess the faint relief that came with the fading voices. Were they truly gone, or were they simply waiting for me to emerge? My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, the darkness around me becoming a canvas for imagined horrors. Eventually, the silence became too much to bear. The strangers' voices had all but vanished, leaving the park steeped in an unsettling stillness. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I decided it was time to move. Staying here until morning wasn't an option. This place felt alive in its silence, watching and waiting. I shifted my weight cautiously, the brittle wood of the ticket booth groaning softly beneath me. I froze, holding my breath. When no footsteps or voices responded, I prepared to make my next move. The path back to the entrance was a labyrinth of shadows and broken attractions, each step filled with uncertainty. I kept low, moving slowly and carefully, hyper-aware of my surroundings. The moonlight filtering through the overgrown trees cast distorted shapes on the ground, and every shifting shadow made my heart skip. My instincts screamed that I wasn't alone, though the silence offered no proof. As I made my way past the carousel, the flickering candles caught my attention again. Their flames burned unnaturally steady, as if untouched by the breeze. The animal skulls, which I had tried to dismiss earlier, now seemed like part of something deliberate, something malicious. I avoided looking too closely, afraid of what I might notice if I lingered. The further I moved, the more the park seemed to resist my escape. Paths that felt familiar during the daylight now twisted unnaturally, leading me to dead ends or looping back toward areas I was desperate to avoid. Several times I paused, straining to listen, convinced I heard faint whispers or the crunch of footsteps behind me. Each time I saw nothing but the empty expanse of the park. As I neared the edge of the park, the rusted skeleton of a Ferris wheel loomed above me, its silhouette stark against the night sky. A guttural sound, a low, almost growling murmur, emanated from somewhere nearby, freezing me in place. My eyes darted to the shadows, searching for movement. When nothing appeared, I forced myself to keep moving, the sound echoing in my mind long after it stopped. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the road. My chest burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't slow down until the park was a distant dark smudge on the horizon. Only then did I dare to look back, half expecting to see a figure silhouetted against the moonlight. But the gate stood empty, its darkness indifferent to my escape. The highway stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the dark. Late-night drives were a ritual for me, an escape from the noise of the day, a chance to think without distraction. The empty roads offered a sense of solitude I craved, the hum of the engine a soothing rhythm that matched the quiet of the night. The stillness felt comforting at first, as if the world had fallen into a peaceful slumber. The stars above were faint, their light barely cutting through the black expanse, while the occasional road sign flickered past in the glow of my headlights. It was just me, the car, and the road ahead. No other vehicles, no signs of life beyond the occasional silhouette of a tree or the outline of a distant hill. I'd been driving for about an hour when I first noticed the headlights. They appeared suddenly, far behind me, two distant points of light that seemed unremarkable at first. A fellow traveler on the same stretch of highway, I assumed, but something about them began to bother me. They weren't getting closer, nor were they fading into the distance. They stayed the same, always there in my rearview mirror, unwavering. The first stirrings of unease crept in, subtle but persistent. I adjusted my speed slightly, slowing to see if the car would overtake me. It didn't. Instead, it mirrored my change, maintaining the same distance. I sped up, testing the reaction, and again, the car matched me. The calm of the drive was slipping away, replaced by a growing tension I couldn't ignore. I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Another driver heading in the same direction, keeping a safe distance. It made sense, until it didn't. The miles passed, and the headlights remained constant, neither closing the gap nor falling away. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as I watched them in the mirror, my thoughts racing. I needed to be sure. Up ahead, a smaller road branched off from the main highway. It was a shortcut I'd taken before, a winding path that cut through the countryside and reconnected with the highway farther ahead. I decided to take it, hoping the other car would continue straight and prove my fears unfounded. I turned sharply onto the narrow road, the tires crunching on the uneven surface. For a moment I thought I'd lost them, but then, in the rearview mirror, the glow of the headlights reappeared. My stomach sank. The car had followed. The road grew darker, the trees on either side forming a dense canopy that blocked out what little moonlight there was. The headlights behind me seemed brighter now, more focused, their glow a constant reminder of my unwelcome company. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind was fixated on the vehicle trailing me. It wasn't random. They were following me. The unease I'd been feeling deepened into something colder, heavier, a gnawing anxiety that settled in my chest. My pulse quickened as I considered my options, none of them good. The road was too isolated for help, and turning back wasn't an option with the car behind me. I tried to keep my breathing steady, gripping the wheel tightly as I navigated the twists and turns. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. The car jolted, and a sinking sense of dread filled me as the dashboard lights flickered. "Not now," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the car stalling. The engine cut off completely, forcing me to coast to the side of the road. I sat there in the silence, the weight of the situation settling over me. In the rearview mirror, the headlights of the other car stopped, their glow steady and unmoving. They were close, too close. I tried turning the key, willing the engine to start, but it only clicked uselessly. Panic began to rise as I looked back at the other car. It hadn't moved. The headlights illuminated the empty road, but the driver stayed inside, unseen, unresponsive. The minutes dragged on. My hands trembled as I fiddled with the ignition again, desperate for any sign of life from the engine. A cold sweat prickled at my neck as I glanced repeatedly at the other car, expecting it to lurch forward at any moment. The silence was unbearable. I watched the other car, my heart hammering in my chest. The driver wasn't getting out. They weren't leaving. They were just sitting there, waiting. I had no idea what they wanted, but the deliberate nature of their actions filled me with a deep, primal fear. Then the car moved, slowly. It crept forward, the sound of its engine low and deliberate, each inch closing the gap between us. The headlights grew brighter in the mirror, their glow washing over the interior of my car. I couldn't move. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I watched the car inch closer, its approach agonizingly slow. I didn't know what I'd do if they reached me. Run? Hide? Confront them? None of it seemed feasible. The isolation of the road, the darkness, and the stillness of the night had stripped me of any sense of control. But then, just as the other car seemed poised to close the gap, it stopped. The engine idled for a moment, its growl filling the silence. I held my breath, waiting for what would come next. The seconds stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last, and then, without warning, the car reversed. It pulled back slowly, its headlights shrinking in my mirror. A moment later, it turned, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. I was alone again, but the relief I should have felt didn't come. My heart still raced, my hands shaking as I stared at the empty road. The night was silent once more, but the fear lingered, a constant reminder of how close I had come to something. The red glow of the car's taillights had long since faded, swallowed by the darkness, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I sat frozen behind the wheel, my breath shallow and uneven, my fingers gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would somehow expose me further to the oppressive stillness outside. The hum of the crickets in the distance felt mocking, as if nature had resumed its calm while I remained suspended in terror. Eventually, the cold logic of my situation began to take hold. I couldn't stay here. My car was dead, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. The stranger had left for now, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that they might return. I had to get my car running again. The thought alone sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through me. If I got out, I'd be exposed, vulnerable. But staying wasn't an option either. I reached for the latch to pop the hood, the sound of it releasing startlingly loud in the still night. With shaking hands, I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I made my way to the front of the car. The beam of light wavered as I shone it over the engine, my trembling hands making it hard to focus. The fear wasn't just in my head. It felt like a presence around me, pressing in from the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every faint chirp of an insect sent my nerves into overdrive. I forced myself to focus, remembering the basic mechanical fixes I had learned over the years. My hands fumbled with the connections, checking the battery, looking for anything out of place. All the while, I kept glancing over my shoulder, the shadows beyond the flashlight's reach seeming to move with every shift of my gaze. I don't know how long I spent under the hood, but every second felt like an eternity. The flashlight's beam flickered weakly, and I cursed under my breath, realizing the batteries were dying. Desperation fueled my movements as I adjusted the connections, tightening what I could and hoping against hope that it would be enough. Finally, I stepped back, my heart pounding as I closed the hood and climbed back into the car. My hands were slick with sweat as I turned the key, praying for the engine to roar back to life. For a moment, nothing happened, and my stomach dropped. I tried again, the ignition clicking, struggling, then the engine sputtered to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I needed to leave, and fast. The headlights cut through the darkness as I pulled back onto the road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror out of habit. The sight of the empty stretch behind me did little to ease the tension gripping my chest. I couldn't stop picturing the other car, its headlights suddenly reappearing, bearing down on me again. My grip on the wheel tightened as I accelerated, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound. The road felt endless, the darkness heavier now, as if it were alive and pressing in on me. Every mile felt like a small victory, but the fear refused to loosen its hold. When I first rented the storage unit, it seemed like a practical solution. My apartment was bursting at the seams with boxes, seasonal clothes, and random things I couldn't bring myself to throw away. The facility was nothing fancy, just a long row of identical metal doors, each one painted a dull gray, stretching along a gravel lot. It was functional, cheap, and close to home. Perfect. The manager handed me the keys with little fanfare, and I made my way down the narrow aisle to my unit. The lock was stiff, and it took a few tries to unlatch it. When I rolled up the door, the clatter echoed across the lot, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet afternoon. My stomach turned as I took in the sight inside. The unit wasn't empty. It was cluttered with junk, though calling it junk didn't feel quite right. There were boxes filled with strange objects, figurines carved from what looked like bone, a cluster of burned-out candles, and bundles of dried plants tied with string. Unmarked videotapes were stacked in one corner, the black plastic casings coated with dust. Loose papers were scattered across the floor, scribbled with symbols and fragmented phrases that made no sense. Phrases like, "Open the door that never shuts," and "What was taken will return." I stood frozen for a long moment, my mind racing. It felt wrong to touch anything, but I forced myself to step inside, brushing away the unease creeping up my spine. It was someone else's mess. Someone who, judging by the dust, hadn't been here in a long time. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd rented the unit now, and I needed the space. Whatever this was, I'd clean it out and move on. By the time I cleared out the unit, I had convinced myself it was just eccentric clutter. Maybe the last tenant was into some strange hobbies, or maybe it was just a prank left behind to freak out the next renter. Either way, I packed everything into garbage bags and hauled it to the nearest dump. I didn't want any of it near me. A few days later, the call came. I was at home, half watching something on TV, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Normally I would have ignored it, but for some reason, I picked up. "Hello," I said. There was a pause on the other end before a man's voice came through. Calm, measured. "Did you rent Unit 47? The question caught me off guard. My mind immediately went to the stuff I'd thrown out. Yeah, who's this?" "What happened to the items inside?" he asked, ignoring my question. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't place, something that made my stomach tighten. "I got rid of them," I said cautiously. "Why?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, without another word, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, a knot of unease forming in my chest. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the old tenant, annoyed that I hadn't waited for them to pick up their things. Still, the way the man had spoken, so calm and deliberate, left a sour feeling I couldn't quite shake. The unease from the call lingered over the next few days, though I tried to push it to the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd done nothing wrong, and there was no reason to dwell on it. But then the strange things started happening. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. During a quick run to the grocery store, I thought I caught someone watching me. A figure standing at the end of the aisle, just out of sight when I turned my head. I brushed it off as paranoia. I was on edge from the call, nothing more. But then it happened again. I was sitting in a cafe, scrolling through my phone, when I felt it. A presence, a weight of someone's gaze. I looked up, scanning the room, but no one seemed to be paying attention to me. Just as I was about to return to my phone, I noticed a figure outside, standing across the street. They were too far to make out any details, but their stance was unmistakable. They were facing me. When I looked again, they were gone. The sightings continued. A shadow in my peripheral vision. A fleeting silhouette in a parking lot. Always distant, always just enough to make me question whether I'd imagined it. But the feeling of being watched was real, and it was growing harder to ignore. The first message arrived late at night, waking me with the sharp buzz of my phone. I squinted at the screen, my grogginess giving way to confusion as I read the text. "Return what isn't yours." There was no sender information, just the number. My heart raced as I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. It had to be a mistake, a prank. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the thought that it was connected to the storage unit. The next day, another message came. This one was longer, its tone even more unsettling. "You don't understand what you've taken. Put it back or suffer the consequences." I tried blocking the number, but the messages continued, coming from different sources. Each one was cryptic, filled with warnings and demands. The language became more threatening as days passed. The the words digging into my already fragile nerves. I considered going to the police, but what would I even say? That someone was sending me strange texts about junk I'd thrown away? I could barely explain it to myself, let alone anyone else. Still, the messages terrified me. The warnings felt deliberate, personal, as if the sender knew me, knew exactly how to get under my skin. The dread only deepened when I noticed that the timing of the messages often coincided with the sightings of the shadowy figure. Whoever, or whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head anymore. The texts were bad enough, but when I found the scratches on my front door, the fear became physical. It was early morning, the sun barely rising, when I stepped out to grab a package and noticed the marks. Thin, jagged lines ran down the wood near the lock, scrapes that hadn't been there the day before. My first thought was an animal, but the pattern didn't match. It looked deliberate, like someone had been trying to force the door open. I checked the lock, running my fingers over the mechanism. It didn't appear broken, but the scratches told a different story. Someone had been here. I spent the rest of the morning combing through my small apartment, checking the windows, closets, and every corner where someone could potentially hide. Nothing was out of place, but the search left me rattled. It was clear now, whoever was sending the messages wasn't just taunting me. They were escalating. I considered calling the police, but I stopped myself. What would I tell them? That someone had left scratches on my door and sent cryptic texts? I didn't even know who was behind it. Without proof or a name, it felt pointless. Instead, I reinforced the locks, pushed a chair under the doorknob, and stayed close to the window that night, scanning the street for movement. My stomach churned with the thought that the figure, the one I'd seen in so many places, might be out there, watching. The realization that my home wasn't safe anymore weighed heavily on me. The paranoia grew stronger with each passing day. I began hearing faint sounds at night, scratches on the window, the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway outside my door. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, but the noises persisted, each one fraying my nerves a little more. One evening, I returned home to find the window in my kitchen slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. My heart raced as I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Had someone been inside? Were they still here? I searched the apartment again, this time more methodically, my hands trembling as I opened closets and checked under furniture. I found nothing, but that didn't calm me. The sense of intrusion lingered, a sickening feeling that someone had been in my space, touching my things. Then there were the items I couldn't explain. A drawer left ajar when I was certain I'd closed it. A pen I hadn't used sitting on the counter. Small, subtle changes that added up to an overwhelming dread. It felt like the unseen presence was tightening its grip, infiltrating my life in ways I couldn't control. I stopped sleeping, jolted awake by every small sound. My phone vibrated with more messages, each one more threatening than the last. You're running out of time. Put it back before it's too late. I didn't know what it was. The junk from the storage unit was long gone, buried under layers of garbage at the dump. But the sender didn't care. They believed I still had it, and their persistence was wearing me down. One night, as I sat by the window, clutching a kitchen knife and staring at the street below, I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. The fear had consumed every part of my life. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't relax at home, couldn't even go to the store without feeling eyes on me. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, it wasn't going to stop. Leaving felt like my only option. The next morning, I contacted my landlord and told them I was breaking my lease. I didn't care about the penalty. I packed my belongings over the next 2 days, stuffing everything into boxes and moving bags, throwing out what I couldn't take with me. As I packed, the unease grew. I half expected the door to burst open, or the shadowy figure to appear in the corner of my vision. The tension made every sound feel like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. But I forced myself to keep going, driven by the desperate need to escape. On the final day, as I loaded the last of my boxes into the car, I paused for a moment at the edge of the lot. My apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. I turned back toward it, scanning the windows for any sign of movement, any sign that I was being watched. The new apartment was smaller, tucked away in a quiet suburb miles from my old place. The streets were unnervingly quiet as I walked toward the ATM, the glow of its screen standing out against the darkened storefronts. It wasn't unusual for me to be out late like this. I'd gotten used to the calm of the city after midnight. Still, there was something about tonight that felt different. The air was thick, the silence heavier than usual, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I approached the machine, glancing around out of habit. Nothing seemed out of place. A faint hum emanated from the ATM as I inserted my card, my fingers fumbling slightly as I entered my PIN. The cash dispensed with a mechanical whir, and I quickly pocketed the bills. That's when I noticed him. A figure stood a short distance away, partially obscured by the shadow of a lamppost. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching me. My stomach tightened. Maybe he was just another late-night wanderer, someone passing through. But the way he stood so still, his posture rigid, set off alarms in my head. I averted my gaze, willing myself to stay calm. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the ATM, keeping my pace casual. But as I moved, so did he. I quickened my steps, glancing back over my shoulder. The man was following me, his pace deliberate but unhurried. My mind raced, running through possibilities. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was heading in the same direction. But every instinct in me screamed that this was no accident. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement as I turned a corner. The buildings here were older, their facades dark and lifeless. I hoped the man would pass me, that I'd hear his footsteps fade into the distance. But instead they grew louder, echoing in the stillness of the night. I turned again, this time onto a smaller side street. My heartbeat quickened as I realized how empty the area was. No cars, no late-night pedestrians, just the soft hum of the city far in the distance. I could hear his footsteps now, steady and methodical, always a few beats behind mine. Panic began to creep in. My hands clenched into fists as I fought the urge to run. Running would confirm my fear, make it real. But when I glanced back and saw the man's figure still there, still closing the distance, I couldn't hold back anymore. I ran. The sound of my feet slapping against the pavement echoed down the alley as I sprinted away, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. The man's footsteps followed, faster now, their rhythm matching my frantic pace. The streetlights grew sparser as I veered deeper into the maze of alleyways, the shadows swallowing me whole. The walls on either side seemed to close in, their graffiti-covered surfaces blurring as I pushed myself harder. My chest burned, but I didn't dare stop. Every turn felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential trap. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was still there, his figure unnervingly steady, his face obscured by the darkness. The gap between us had narrowed, and the sight of him so close sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I forced my legs to move faster, the fear giving me strength I didn't know I had. Ahead, a chain-link fence loomed, cutting off the end of the alley. I didn't hesitate. I leaped, my fingers grasping the cold metal as I hauled myself up. The fence rattled loudly under my weight, but I didn't stop to think about the noise. I swung my legs over the top and dropped into the backyard on the other side. The backyard was overgrown, the grass thick and unkempt. I stumbled as I landed, falling to my knees before scrambling back to my feet. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting wood, and the faint outline of a shed loomed in the corner. Without thinking, I darted behind it, pressing myself against the rough surface and willing myself to be invisible. My chest heaved as I struggled to quiet my breathing. The world felt unnaturally still, the only sound the blood pounding in my ears. I strained to listen for his footsteps, praying they would fade into the distance. But instead, they grew louder, their rhythm steady and unrelenting. I peeked around the edge of the shed, my heart plummeting as I saw his shadowy figure climbing the fence. He landed with a quiet thud, his movements unnervingly smooth, like he'd done this before. He paused, scanning the backyard, his head tilting slightly as if listening for me. I ducked back behind the shed, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. He was too close. I had to move, had to find another way out. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crouched low and crept along the side of the yard, my every step agonizingly slow. The faint rustle of grass made me freeze. I turned, and for a split second I thought he'd seen me. His figure loomed larger now, moving methodically, his head turning in slow, deliberate arcs. The moment stretched unbearably, but somehow I remained unseen. When his back turned, I bolted again, sprinting toward another fence at the far end of the yard. My hands fumbled for a foothold as I climbed, adrenaline propelling me over the top and onto the other side. I hit the ground running, the chase far from over. The second fence led me into another backyard, smaller and more confined than the last. My foot caught on a loose garden hose, and I stumbled forward, nearly hitting the ground. I caught myself just in time, but the delay had cost me precious seconds. I could hear him now, closer than before. His footsteps had picked up speed, his relentless pursuit driving me into an all-consuming panic. I darted toward a narrow path at the side of the yard, barely visible in the darkness. My shoulder brushed against the edge of a wooden fence as I turned sharply, the rough splinters catching on my jacket. The path led me to another alley, even darker and narrower than the first. The sound of the stranger's pursuit echoed unnervingly, his steps amplified by the close walls around us. Every turn I took seemed to lead to another dead end, another barrier I had to climb or navigate. My breaths came in shallow gasps, my legs screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. The fear of him catching me was enough to drown out the pain. I vaulted over another fence, landing awkwardly in a backyard strewn with children's toys. A plastic tricycle tipped over as I scrambled past, the sound impossibly loud in the silent night. I froze, glancing back over my shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest. The silhouette of the stranger appeared on the fence I had just climbed, his movements unnervingly fluid as he dropped into the yard. I sprinted toward a gate at the far end of the yard, fumbling with the latch in a frenzy. It stuck at first, and I nearly screamed in frustration before it finally gave way. I slipped through and into yet another alley, my eyes darting frantically for any sign of escape. My surroundings blurred as I pushed myself forward, the adrenaline in my veins barely keeping me upright. Ahead, I spotted a narrow opening between two buildings, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Without hesitation, I dove into the gap, the rough brick walls pressing against my sides as I forced my way through. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. When I emerged on the other side, I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving as I fought for air. For a brief moment, the silence returned, and I dared to hope that I'd finally lost him. But then, faintly I heard it, the sound of footsteps. He was still coming. Panic clawed at me as I struggled to my feet, the weight of exhaustion threatening to pull me down. I scanned my surroundings desperately, my eyes landing on a small park just ahead. The overgrown trees and uneven terrain offered some semblance of cover, and I sprinted toward it, my fear pushing me forward. The park was a tangled mess of shadows and moonlight, the faint glow of the streetlights barely piercing through the dense canopy of leaves. I darted between the trees, my movements erratic as I tried to stay hidden. The sound of my pursuer's footsteps faded briefly, giving me a glimmer of hope. I crouched behind a large oak tree, pressing myself against its rough bark as I strained to listen. The silence was deafening, every small sound amplified by my heightened senses. My fingers dug into the ground for stability as I waited, my breaths shallow and controlled. Then I saw him. He entered the park from the same path I had taken, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. He moved slowly now, methodically, his head turning in deliberate arcs as he scanned the area. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I waited until his back was turned, then crept deeper into the park, using the uneven terrain to stay out of sight. Every step felt like a gamble, every moment a test of my endurance. Finally, I spotted a path leading back to a main road. It was risky, but it was my best chance at escape. Summoning the last reserves of my strength, I bolted for the path, my legs burning as I pushed myself forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear of what might be behind me was enough to keep me running. When I emerged onto the main road, the world seemed almost painfully bright in comparison to the darkness I'd just left. The hum of distant traffic and the glow of streetlights felt surreal, as if I'd stepped into a different reality. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me, until I reached the relative safety of a late-night diner. The office after hours was a completely different place. The hum of conversations, the clatter of keyboards, and the ringing of phones that defined the workday were replaced by an unsettling quiet. The overhead lights cast long, sterile shadows, while the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs created a persistent, almost oppressive backdrop. I didn't mind working late. In fact, I often found it easier to concentrate when the building was empty. There were no interruptions, no meetings, no casual chatter. Tonight, I stayed back to finish a looming project, the kind of task that demanded focus I could never find during regular hours. As I settled into the rhythm of my work, the solitude felt comforting. But the silence had a way of amplifying the smallest noises, the creak of a chair in the distance, the faint click of a vent shifting. I told myself it was just the building settling, the kind of sounds you don't notice when the office is bustling with activity. An hour passed, and I leaned back to stretch, the soft groan of my chair echoing in the empty space. My eyes wandered toward the darkened hallway leading to the break room. Something felt different. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. Shaking off the thought, I turned back to my desk and dove back into my work. The first sign was subtle. I'd left my water bottle on the far edge of my desk, tucked neatly next to my notepad. When I reached for it, it wasn't there. Frowning, I scanned the desk and found it a few inches away, teetering on the edge as if it had been moved. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if I'd been careless and knocked it while typing. I shrugged it off, dismissing the incident as nothing. But then came the sounds. At first they were faint, a soft rustling like papers shifting in the wind. I paused, holding my breath to listen. The sound stopped as quickly as it had begun. I glanced around the room. Everything was still. Minutes later, I heard it again, this time a distant creak, like a door slowly opening. I froze, staring at the hallway that stretched out into the dimly lit corridors. I couldn't see anything, but the sound lingered in my mind, gnawing at my focus. Swallowing the unease, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the air conditioning or an old hinge giving way to the night's coolness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The feeling grew stronger the longer I stayed. My work barely held my attention as my senses sharpened, attuned to every creak and shuffle. I finally decided to investigate, hoping to ease my mind. Grabbing my phone for its flashlight, I stepped into the hallway. The building felt vast and empty, its shadows stretching far beyond what I could see. My footsteps echoed, louder than I expected, as I made my way toward the break room. The vending machines buzzed softly in the corner, their dim lights flickering slightly. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the air felt thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I turned back toward my desk, but as I did, a flicker caught my eye. A shadow, quick and fleeting, darting across the far end of the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. A second passed, then two. Nothing moved. Just my imagination, I whispered, though the words rang hollow. I forced myself to walk back to my desk, the growing unease pressing down on me like a weight. When I sat down, my monitor had gone to sleep. As I jiggled the mouse, I noticed something on my desk was missing again. This time, my pen. The missing pen was unnerving. I had been using it just minutes ago. It wasn't on the floor or anywhere on my desk. My heart raced as I scanned the area, a creeping paranoia beginning to take hold. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd put it somewhere without thinking, or maybe it had rolled off the desk. But as I searched, the unsettling thought that someone else might have moved it lingered in the back of my mind. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from down the hall. It wasn't the random creak of an old building or the whisper of air through vents. It was deliberate, almost like footsteps, but quieter, more careful. I stood, clutching my phone like a lifeline, and followed the sound. My steps were slow, deliberate, as I crept down the hallway. At the far end, a door stood closed. It was one of the storage rooms, rarely used. The sound was coming from the other side. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air around me felt colder, heavier. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to listen. The sound was faint now, a soft scrape, like metal against wood. My breath hitched, and my pulse thundered in my ears. The knob didn't turn. The door was locked. I stepped back, the cold dread spreading through my chest. Whatever was making that noise wasn't supposed to be there. Fighting the urge to run, I turned and walked briskly back to my desk, determined to pack up and leave. But when I got there, I froze. My monitor had been moved. The slight tilt it had always had was gone, replaced by a perfectly straight alignment. The sight of my perfectly aligned monitor stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't touched it since I'd arrived, and I always left it tilted slightly upward. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Someone, or something, had been at my desk. The faint shuffle I'd heard earlier now felt closer, more real, and utterly deliberate. A sudden crash shattered the silence. It came from down the hall, the sound of something heavy falling and clattering against the floor. My body tensed, instinctively turning toward the noise. My heart pounded in my chest as adrenaline surged through me. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself moving toward the source of the sound. I crept down the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. The sound had come from the conference room. Its glass walls were dimmed with blinds, the interior shrouded in shadow. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, slowly pushing the door open. Inside, a stack of chairs lay toppled over, scattered across the floor. The air felt heavier inside, almost suffocating. I stepped cautiously into the room, scanning every corner. Nothing moved. The room was empty. I turned back toward the hallway, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I heard it again, a faint, deliberate shuffle, this time closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I grabbed a heavy stapler from a nearby desk, clutching it like a weapon as I moved down the hall. My footsteps were soft, careful, as I strained to hear the sound again. It felt like the entire building was alive, every creak and groan amplified by my paranoia. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, playing tricks on my mind. Then I saw it, a fleeting figure at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, humanoid, but unnaturally still. My breath hitched as it slipped out of sight, disappearing into the darkness of the stairwell. A surge of panic and anger coursed through me. Whoever, or whatever, this was, they were toying with me, testing how far I would go. I edged closer to the stairwell, the stapler in my hand feeling woefully inadequate. The shadows inside seemed impenetrable, the faint glow from the hallway doing little to illuminate the space. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, peering into the darkness below. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation. Then I heard it, a low, deliberate exhale. My pulse quickened as the sound reverberated through the stairwell. I backed away slowly, my mind screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, the lights above me flickered and went out. The darkness was complete, swallowing the hallway in an instant. My hands fumbled for my phone, the screen's weak glow my only source of light. The shadows seemed to close in, pressing against me from all sides. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I turned and ran, the stapler slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Every instinct urged me to move faster, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was behind me. Doors slammed shut as I passed, the sound sending fresh waves of panic coursing through me. Reaching the elevator, I jabbed at the button repeatedly, my hands trembling. The faint ding of the arriving car was the only thing keeping me grounded. I stumbled inside, slamming the button for the ground floor as the doors closed behind me. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief as the elevator began its descent. Then the lights inside the elevator flickered. The car jerked to a stop. My stomach dropped as the walls closed in around me. I clutched my phone tightly, its glow barely illuminating the small space. The faint shuffle of movement outside the elevator reached my ears, slow and deliberate. The sense of being trapped was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, the elevator jolted back to life, descending the final floors. When the doors opened, I bolted into the lobby, not stopping until I burst through the front doors into the cool night air.